Hi everyone, and welcome to our June reading wrap-up. I only have 6 books to talk about this month and 1 DNF, so 7 in total. I didn't read a whole lot this month. I was actually a lot busier than I expected to be, but that's okay. I still think that what I accomplished is a good number. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is my DNF. And just get that out of the way. So I DNF'd The Keys to Grammercy Park, which was and I forget the author, but I'll put it up on the screen. It was a NetGalley arc I did, which when I do NetGalley arcs, I really don't want to DNF them because I feel like when I get a NetGalley arc, I'm kind of obligated to read that book because I've gotten, special advance copy, so I want to read it and I want to give it a review. But I just could not finish The Keys to Grammercy Park, and it's really sad because I was actually really excited for this book. Like, I've been seeing things about The Keys to Grammercy Park for months, and everything I've seen on it, I was like, yes, I want to read this book, I want to read this book. So when I got the NetGalley approval, I was like, oh yes, I get to read it, but I just really didn't like it. And it's not even just that I didn't like it, because if it's a NetGalley arc and I'm just not feeling it, I'll still finish it because I feel kind of obligated. But it really actually made me angry. The narrative made me mad, and I was like, okay, I'm so mad at this, I cannot finish it. So, and it's very rare for a book to full on make me mad, so that's just something it did. It made me mad. I can't tell you why because that would be a spoiler, but all I'll say is it felt like an episode of Law and Order went wrong. And I don't like Law and Order, but I have people in my family who watch it, and so sometimes, you're just in the room spending time with your family and it's on TV, so you end up watching it even though you don't like it, and yeah, that's what it reminded me of. A really bad episode of Law and Order. It was bad. And it annoyed me, and it made me mad. It made me mad. And if you've read The Keys to Grammercy Park, you probably know what part made me mad. It was around chapter 18 or 19, I think. It took me forever to get into it, first of all. It's I actually had to force myself to read it up until chapter 8 because I was just not into it. And then finally around chapter 8, I was like, okay, I'm finally starting to get into the storyline. I'm getting into it. And then chapter 18, 19, something happens. And I was like, what? Are you kidding me? No, I'm done. I'm done. This is messed up. Anyway, so I DNF'd The Keys to Grammercy Park. And the first book in June that I finished was called Hooked on You by Kathleen Fuller, which last month in May, I read Kathleen Fuller's 2 to Tango on NetGalley, which is actually 2 to Tango is actually the 4th book in a series, but it's just something that I found randomly on NetGalley, and I was like, this looks cute, so I read it. So in June, I went back and I read the first 2 books in the series. I haven't read the 3rd book yet, but it's on my list for July. But the first book in the series is called Hooked on You, and it was actually really cute. It's about a girl, I believe her name is Riley, who she's living in New York and trying to be an artist, but she's kind of failing. And then her grandmother calls and says that she broke her leg in a church baseball game, and she's laid up, and she needs Riley to come home and help take care of her and help take care of the yarn store until her leg heals. And so Riley has not been home in 10 years since she left that small town to go to New York because because she feels kind of shame in her hometown because of some things that her mother did when she was a child. Her mother is a little bit unstable. She's a alcohol addict and a drug addict, and she did not take care of Riley as a child, so Riley lived with her grandmother in her teen years, but Riley always kind of carried that shame of, this is who my mother is. So when she leaves that small town, she swears that she's not going to step foot back in it until she's a big time artist in New York and kind of proves herself or whatever, which she hasn't done yet, so she hasn't gone home. But her grandmother needs her, so she's like, okay, I'm going to go home and take care of my grandmother. So she goes home, and since her grandmother's leg is broken, she can't pick her up from her airport, so she sends this guy who happens to be Riley's high school crush. His name is Hayden, and he is an ex-pro baseball player, but he threw out his arm in his like first Major League Baseball game and had to retire due to injury, and he moved back home. So they have a little romance, but it's also like Riley learning that, you know, she doesn't have to carry that shame of her childhood, that she is a new creation in God. And Hayden also, you know, learning about what his life is going to be like now that he's not in the major leagues. You know, his whole plan is gone, so he's trying to buy his dad's hardware store. It's a whole thing. But they have a cute little romance, and it's a really cute story. I really like small town romance stories. I don't really like pro sports people stories. You know, there's like a lot of stories that's like a pro sports player, and then they come down in the whole town and there's like the girl or whatever. I don't tend to like those stories because I just feel like they tend to be kind of cookie cutter in a way. But this one was really, really cute. I really liked Hayden. He was definitely my favorite character in the novel. He was really great. I did wish that it had a little more faith aspects because it is Christian fiction, especially because like it makes a point to talk about how Riley hasn't really gone to church since she was a teenager, and when she comes home, you know, her grandmother goes to church every week and Hayden goes to church every week, but she has trouble doing that, but she does go just to be with her grandmother. And so it kind of talks about her going back to church, but it doesn't really talk about her having any kind of spiritual experience. Like, she just kind of goes back to church. But I really wanted to see her start that relationship with God that she didn't have before. Maybe start, like, praying and start realizing that her value is in God, and that's why she doesn't have to, you know, be ashamed of who her mother was. Not just because of who she is. Because, you know, in the book they talk about, oh, well, you're not your mother. You're a very different person. And that's true. But I really was hoping to see her find her value a little bit more in Christ, which didn't really happen. Like, there's just not a lot of faith content despite the fact that they're going to church. So I gave Hooked on You 3.5 stars. It was really cute. It was really cute. The next book that I read was the second book in that series, which is called Much Ado About Latte. And it was, first of all, the title is a play on Much Ado About Nothing, which happens to be my favorite Shakespeare work. So I was really excited about that. Just from seeing the title, I was like, ooh, we're playing off of Shakespeare. I love it. I'm in. But it follows a girl named Anita who comes from a rich family, but she's kind of trying to, like, prove herself. She had a learning disability growing up, and she had to have, like, a lot of extra tutors. And her two siblings were really high achievers. Like, her brother is a high-end pediatrician, and her sister is in law school, and she works as a waitress. So she feels like she really has to prove herself and do things on her own. And she's working as a waitress in the town's diner, the Sunshine Diner, and the manager of the diner is her old high school crush, Tanner, who's also really smart and a really, really good cook. And she's been in love with him since, like, high school, and he is completely oblivious. So she decides to strike out on her own, and she decides to buy the old building next door to the diner, which she wants to turn into a cafe and coffee shop. And her parents are like, oh, well, we'll help you. We'll give you the money. And she's like, no, I want to do this completely on my own because, you know, she wants to prove that she's, you know, at the same level as her siblings despite the learning disability she had in school and those insecurities. And so she, like, starts, you know, studying business on her own, and she buys the cafe, while at the same time Tanner ends up buying the diner from their old boss. So Tanner and Anita inadvertently become competitors. And they have this competitive thing going on there as they build up their businesses, but also, you know, they're fighting this attraction for each other and the fact that they've been friends since high school, so there's that going on. And a lot of things happen, and it's a very cute story. One problem I had with it was that the fight they had when they found out, you know, what each other had done. Like, he found out that she bought the cafe and she found out that he bought the diner. They have this big fight, and, like, the things that are said, the things that he says, I was like, this is so not okay. Like, this is so devaluing. But there's apologies for that later, and so it does get better. I just felt like there's a lot of things that you could say in an argument, like that an author could put in an argument that would better represent like these hurt feelings for these secrets kept, or that would better represent the fear that they have that, you know, their friend is now going to put them out of business or whatever. Like, there's a lot better things that could, there's a better route that argument could have taken than it did, because the way it went was just like very degrading, and I found that very upsetting. I also found a little bit of her behavior kind of upsetting, like just some of the situations that they're thrown in that's supposed to be like tension. Like, I was like, okay, you guys are supposed to be, you know, good Christian people, like what are you doing? Yeah. So that one also got 3.5 stars, because it is kind of cute, but I would kind of classify it more as clean fiction than Christian fiction. Just that. So there's that. The next 3 books that I read were a series by Kimberly Comeaux. Comeaux? I don't know how to say her name. She is a Christian fiction author. I was going through my library catalog, like the Christian fiction section of my library catalog, and these books came up, and I had never heard of her. And actually, I was like, are these Christian? Because I looked at the covers, and the covers kind of reminded me of like an old 90s Harlequin novel. Like, some of the covers, I was like, is this a Christian fiction thing, or is this just historical romance in general? But I did a little research on the author, and she is Christian fiction. And I read the descriptions of these books, and they kind of reminded me a little bit of like a Lori Wick book. So I was like, oh, okay, I'll give it a try. So I checked this 3-book series out from the library, and it's called just the Regency Bride series, I think. And the first book in the series is called The Vicar's Daughter, which is a very generic name. Also a title that I feel would come from a 90s Harlequin novel, to be honest. But anyway, so I was a little skeptical when I started reading it, but it was actually really cute. There's this Earl, and he gets partially crippled in the war. He gets a leg injury to where he is in a lot of pain, and he limps all the time, so he's really injured. And then his dad dies, and then his brother gets lost at sea and dies. So he goes through a lot all at once, and he gets really angry and stops going to church, and he breaks off his engagement to this woman, and he gets in a duel with somebody. So he's basically become a very bad person. He's on the outs of society, and so he moves back home to his country estate. And there, he runs into the vicar's daughter, who is in his tree trying to rescue a cat that went up a tree. Which I find funny that people think they have to rescue cats from trees, because cats are actually really, really good climbers. I've had cats my whole life, and y'all, they get on everything. They get on the roof, they get on trees, they can get down. I promise you, they can get down. Anyway, so she sees this cat up a tree on this guy's estate, and so she goes through his fence and climbs this tree to try to rescue this cat. And this cat, just jumps down to the ground, because obviously he's fine. But then now she is stuck in the tree. So then she ends up, falling out of the tree and falling into this guy's arms. And he is why did this woman randomly fall out of my tree into my arms? And he's really, really angry, because he wants his solitude. He wants to just wallow in his grief and his pity alone. So he's like, get off my property. I don't want to talk to you. Especially when he finds out who she is, because this being his country estate and her being the vicar's daughter, they actually grew up together, and she was a bit of a pest. And so he's like, oh no, it's the annoying vicar's daughter. Please go away and leave me alone. But then a lawyer brings a baby, an infant, to his door, because his brother, who died at sea, had been married, and it turned out that his sister-in-law just died in childbirth. So his nephew is now under his custody, and so the lawyer brings him, and he's like, congratulations, you get a 2-week-old baby, here you go. And so obviously the Earl is his name is Nicholas, I think. Nicholas is oh my goodness, what do? I have, my nephew now, and I'm trying to be angry in my solitude, I'm angry at everything. So he tells his butler, and he's like, can you find somebody in the town who can help me find a governess? And the butler was like, oh yeah, the vicar's daughter. She helps with that kind of stuff all the time. So they go and they get her, and she comes back. And so she helps him find a governess, and then she kind of sticks around to help the governess settle in and everything. But then she realizes that Nicholas has become so angry at God. And he actually says, he's like, I stopped going to church because I'm just really angry at God for, like, my dad dying and my brother dying and everything that's happened. So then she makes it, like, her personal vendetta to, like, show him the love of God again. And that's really what she, like, goes into it as. She's like, okay, I'm going to stick around, and I'm going to do my best to be this guy's friend so that he'll know the love of God. But then, of course, things happen. They end up falling in love. But, an earl can't marry a vicar's daughter because it's outside the ton or whatever, and so there's that going on. But yeah, it was a really, really cute book. I gave it 4 stars. There was, a level of predictability to it, and there was a level of, like, it's a very light kind of trying to be deep, but it's not actually really deep kind of going on there. And so it wasn't a masterpiece, but I did really enjoy it, so I gave it 4 stars. The next book in the series is called The Engagement. And I cannot tell you anything about this book without spoiling, because the main couple in this book are directly related to the main couple of the first book of The Vicar's Daughter. So if I tell you even who they are, it would be spoilers to something that happens in the first book. So all I'm going to say is that the next book in the series is called The Engagement. I gave it 3.5 stars. The main girl really kind of annoyed me because I felt like her conflict went on way too long. I was like, girl, you know it's wrong, just don't do it. But that's all I can tell you, because like the events of the second novel are directly related to the events of the first novel, so telling you anything about it would be spoilers. The third novel in the series is called Remember Me. And I can't talk to you about this because it's actually about friends of the couple from the first novel, and not really, and the events don't really directly relate, so it won't be a spoiler to tell you about it. So the Earl in the first novel, Nicholas, his best friend is a duke. He's the Duke of Northingshire or Northingham or something, like kind of clearly a made up title, but anyway, not very creative, I'm sorry. His name is Trevor Kent, but everybody calls him North because it's part of his title. And then the vicar's daughter, her best friend is named Helen, and she's like a gentleman farmer's daughter. And Helen falls in love with North during the first book, but North kind of avoids her because he's a duke and she is a gentleman farmer's daughter, so there's like no way that's happening. So it's kind of like this whole unrequited thing. But in the third novel, which actually takes place in America, North has cousins that own a plantation in Louisiana, so he's actually going to Louisiana to visit his cousins and to see their plantation, which, since he's the Duke, he technically owns part of it because he's the head of the family. He owns part of everything in their family. Whereas Helen has actually recently moved to Louisiana to be a governess and tutor to a girl there who is a marquis's granddaughter, I think. Yeah. And so she's going there to teach that young Louisiana girl who grew up in America, where we do whatever we want, how to be an English lady. And she's been living there for a few months and they're waiting in the town that she lives in is like 20 miles away from the plantation that North is going to. But North's ship is actually wrecked on the way there during a storm, and he washes up on shore with no memory. But he has, one of his passengers on the ship was a pastor that was coming to pastor the town that Helen lives in, and he had his Bible in his jacket. So when the people found him washed up on shore, they assumed that he was the pastor and not the Duke that he is. And he has no memory. So they bring him to the town because they're like, this is the pastor we found on shore. Well, when Helen sees him, she obviously knows he is not a pastor. He is the Duke of Northingshire, Northingham, or whatever it is. But she is like, well, this is my chance to convince him without our social barriers that we actually do fit together really well. So she tells him that he's the pastor. And she's like, yeah, you're totally the pastor. Yay. And so he's like, oh, okay, well, I don't remember anything about being a pastor, and it feels kind of wrong, but if you say so, okay. Which obviously shenanigans ensue because she's lying to this dude that has no memory. And as would happen in any of these novels, his memory does come back eventually. And they have to kind of work on that out because she's been lying to him this whole time. So, I liked Helen and North. I felt like they had good chemistry. However, I also felt like when the truth did come out, when he did regain his memory, that conflict resolution was just really, like that. Like, there was... So, yeah, I didn't feel like that was very realistic. But, yeah, I just didn't feel like their conflict resolution was very realistic, so I only gave it 3 stars, because there's just no way. There's just no way. There's no conflict about that. Let's move on to the last book that I read this month, which is Stories That Bind Us by Susie Finkbeiner. I hope I said that right. This is a lot deeper than the rest of the books I read this month. This has been like a very light reading month for me, like story-wise. Like they're all the previous books I read have just been really light and fun romances. I haven't really read anything deep except for this one. This book was deep enough for like everything. This book, it takes place in the 1960s, and it follows a woman named Betty Sweet, who her husband dies unexpectedly at the beginning of the book, and she's only like 40 years old, so he dies very prematurely. Like, he just comes home from work one day, like he's complaining that he's not feeling well, and then he just dies in his chair, like it's something to do with his heart. It's really sad. So she is grieving, and it kind of delves into her childhood during her grief a bit. It turns out that her mother died when she was 14, and she and her younger sister, Claire, were raised by their father, who didn't really want the responsibility of raising 2 girls without a mother. So he moved them around a lot. He didn't really take care of them. Like, he didn't really give them a lot of money to pay for food or clothing. Like, they were there, like all their clothing was threadbare. And so her mother dies when she's 12, and then she moves to this town when she's 14, and she meets this man who ends up becoming her husband when she's 14 years old, and he's just really kind. He brings them a loaf of bread each week, so in a way he's kind of like taking care of her from a young age, and she really trusts him. And she really trusts his family, who, like, his mother comes by when the girls are like sitting on their steps, and she's like, why aren't you in school? And Betty's like, oh, well, our dad is, he kind of forgot to enroll us because he just doesn't care. And it turns out he doesn't want to spend the money on new school books and stuff, so he just doesn't enroll them in school. And the mom, they call her Mama Sweet. She's like, well, I will take care of it. And so she takes them and gets them books, and she gets them enrolled in school. So it's really like this sweet family is taking care of Betty and Claire in place of their father. So Betty grows up and she marries Norman, who's the boy, and she gets married to him when she's like 17. So they have a very long marriage, and so to have him unexpectedly die at 40 is really hard for her, because in a lot of ways this family took care of her from her early teens, and they kind of saved her in a way. So losing her husband is extra hard, But then, like 2 months after he dies, her sister, Claire, who she's been estranged from for like 7 years, shows up at her door with a 5-year-old son who is black, or half black, obviously, because she's Claire's son. And this is the 1960s, so that's a big deal. Which Betty is, of course, automatically like, okay, this is my nephew. Like, I love him no matter what. But it turns out that Claire needs some help. And so, as Claire and her son stay, his name is Hugo, by the way. As Claire and Hugo stay with Betty for a couple of days, and it turns into a couple of weeks, Betty starts noticing things about Claire that aren't quite right, and it brings back these memories of her mother. And then it is revealed that the mother, who died when she was 12, actually died from suicide because she had mental instability. my guess, from what everything says, I'm pretty sure she is manic depressive, just based on her mood changes and stuff. But obviously in the 1960s, they didn't really have names for these kind of things, so they just said she was like crazy, and she had to go to an asylum or a mental state hospital, and she died in the hospital. She committed suicide in the hospital. So Claire is now showing signs of that same illness that their mother had. So Betty takes Claire to the state hospital, and Claire is admitted into the state hospital. And so now Betty is raising Hugo while her sister is in a mental hospital. Her husband recently died. Her sister is in a mental hospital with the same mental illness that killed their mother. Like, a lot is going on. And this book takes place over a summer. And it's really heavy subject matter, because you have race issues with a white woman having a mixed race nephew. You have mental illness issues with her sister being manic depressive, which in the 1960s they didn't know what that was. You have grief issues as her husband has just died, and she's also bringing back all these memories of being raised with a mentally unstable mother and an absent father, and like all this stuff is going on at the same time. So in a way, it could be a very depressing book, but I actually would qualify it more as like melancholy instead of depressing, because it's such deep subject matter, and yet the way the book reads, it kind of takes you on like a day-by-day course. So like, Monday she wakes up and she takes her nephew to the park, and he's just enraptured by this fountain that has like colorful lights in it to make the water look different colors. And she's talking about, she's sharing these, she's watching him do this while in her memory she's thinking of her and her sister as children being at this park and that kind of thing. And so because the narrative goes like day by day and is taking you through the day by day actions, it gives that heavy subject matter kind of a lighter, more realistic flair, because, and it is realistic, because if somebody is going through something really hard like this, yes, that is a big part of their life, but that's not 24/7 what's going on. Like, they are still living day to day, and that's just their day to day. So having this narrative that takes Betty and her nephew day to day really helps it seem more realistic, but it also helps it make it better to like chew in a way, because you're not just being bombarded with all these dramatic issues in the narrative. You're saying like, this is all going on, but we're also still living life day to day. So it makes it easier to take. It's called Stories That Bind Us because one of the ways that Betty bonds with Hugo is by telling him these bedtime stories. And a lot of these bedtime stories have like double meanings. Like when he's scared of the dark, she tells him a story about a girl who's scared of the dark, so she wished to turn into a bird so that she could follow the sun. But then she got tired of flying every day following the sun, so then she had to she landed on a branch, and she realized in order to go back home she was going to have to fly through the dark, so she had to get over that fear. So it's a lot of cute little stories like that that really help Hugo. They have double meanings that help Hugo through this time, because obviously he's 5 years old and his mother has just been taken to the hospital and he doesn't understand why. But he does understand that she has been doing things that, scare him in a way. But she's still his mother, so he's still like, I want my mommy. Yeah. There's just a lot going on in this book. I gave this book 4 stars. It took me like literally half the month to read through. Like, I started it at the same time as like Much Ado About Latte, but it was the last book that I actually finished, because like I was reading it simultaneously with all the other books, and I think I needed the lighter books to like break myself up during it. And so it took me several weeks to actually read through the whole thing, but it was good the whole time. It was never sad enough to make me cry, but it also never really like made me laugh either. Like, I just kind of had feelings of melancholy reading through the whole time. I just read through it. No strong sadness, no strong happiness, like just going through it, like kind of like floating down a river of narrative. That's how I felt reading this book. Anyway, so those were all my reads for the month of June, and I will see you guys in July.